Imagine for a moment that you are a soldier. You have marched for weeks under a punishing summer sun, deep into enemy territory. The land around you is unnervingly silent. The villages you pass are empty, the wells have been poisoned, and the fields are burned black. There is a strange, sickly, sweet smell on the wind that grows stronger with each passing mile. Your leaders tell you that the enemy is weak, that their prince is a petty tyrant whose small army will shatter at the first sight of your grand host. And then you emerge from a thicket of trees and you see it. It is not an army, it is not a fortress, it is a valley, stretching for 3 kilometers in length and 1 kilometer wide, and it is filled with stakes. Tens of thousands of them, planted in the earth like a grotesque forest, and on every single stake, a body is impaled. Men, women, children, their corpses in various stages of decay, twisting in the breeze, birds of prey circle overhead, their calls mixing with the buzzing of a billion flies. The smell is now overwhelming, a physical force that makes you gag. This is not warfare, this is a message, a work of art sculpted from human suffering. What kind of mind could conceive of such a thing? What kind of man could orchestrate this sprawling theater of death? And for what purpose? This was the sight that greeted Sultan Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople, when he invaded the small principality of Wallachia in the year 1462. The artist of this horror was a prince named Vlad III. History, however, would remember him by a different name, Dracula. To understand the man who would become Dracula, you must first understand the world that created him. The 15th century Balkans were a charnel house, a bloody crossroads where empires clashed. To the south lay the colossal power of the Ottoman Empire, an expansionist Islamic superpower that had shattered the 1,000-year-old Byzantine Empire and now looked greedily towards the heart of Europe. To the north and west were the Catholic kingdoms of Hungary and Poland, determined to halt the Ottoman advance. And squeezed between these titans was the tiny, perpetually embattled Orthodox Christian principality of Wallachia, modern-day southern Romania. To be the Prince of Wallachia was not to sit on a throne, it was to balance on the blade of a knife. The role demanded a man who could be a diplomat one day and a butcher the next, a man who could swear fealty to the Hungarian king in a letter and secretly negotiate with the Ottoman Sultan's envoys in the same week. It was a land of constant, grinding warfare, where betrayal was the common currency and survival was the only true ideology. The system itself was one of pervasive, systemic suffering, where peasants were caught between the ambitions of their own treacherous nobles, called Boyars, and the marching armies of foreign invaders. Into this cauldron of violence was born Vlad III in 1431. His father, Vlad II, was a member of a chivalric order created by the Holy Roman Emperor to defend Christendom against the Ottomans. This was the Order of the Dragon, or Ordo Draconum in Latin. Members were known as Dracula. The name was not sinister, it meant the dragon. When Vlad III came of age, he would be known as Dracula, which simply meant son of the dragon. But the name would acquire a far more terrifying meaning. The defining trauma of Vlad's young life, the event that would forge his soul in ice and fire, came when he was just a boy. In 1442, his father was forced to submit to the authority of the Ottoman Sultan Murad II. To guarantee his loyalty, Vlad and his younger brother Radu were handed over as political hostages. For years, the young princes lived in the Ottoman court, prisoners in a gilded cage. Here, Vlad did not just learn the Turkish language and the customs of his captors, he received a masterclass in the Ottoman mechanics of power. He saw firsthand how the sultans dealt with dissent, how they used calculated, spectacular cruelty to enforce order and project strength. He watched, he learned, and a cold, hard resentment took root in his heart. While his brother Radu grew to admire and even befriend the future Sultan Mehmed, Vlad simmered with a quiet, burning hatred for his captors and a deep-seated contempt for his father, who he saw as weak for having surrendered him. When he finally claimed the throne of Wallachia for the second, more permanent time in 1456, Dracula was no longer the boy hostage. He was a man shaped by trauma, driven by a singular, threefold ambition: to secure his own absolute power, to break the parasitic grip of the treacherous Boyar nobility, and to achieve total independence from the Ottoman Empire that had humiliated him and his country. He viewed his world through a lens of absolute pragmatism. Mercy, compassion, and forgiveness were luxuries a prince of Wallachia could not afford. The only language his enemies, both internal and external, understood was the language of fear. And Dracula would make himself its most fluent speaker. His primary tool, the symbol that would become synonymous with his name, was impalement. It was a punishment of excruciating, prolonged agony, designed not just to kill, but to terrify. The method was meticulously brutal. A large, sharpened stake, often lubricated with oil, was carefully inserted into the victim's body, typically through the rectum or vagina. The stake was thick but not too sharp at the tip to avoid piercing vital organs too quickly. The victim was then hoisted upright, and their own body weight would slowly, inexorably, pull them down the stake over hours, sometimes days. The wooden shaft would rupture intestines, tear through muscle, and emerge through the shoulder, neck, or mouth. Death came from shock, dehydration, exposure, or massive internal bleeding, but it came slowly, agonizingly, and very, very publicly. For those who are interested, and I believe in sharing knowledge, no matter how grim, the process was a grotesque science. There were different styles of impalement for different crimes. A thief might be impaled horizontally through the stomach. A traitorous boyar might be impaled with a higher stake than a common peasant, his rank displayed even in death. Sometimes, to add a layer of psychological torment, the stake would be driven through the body in such a way that the victim would live for 2 or 3 days, a screaming, writhing monument to the prince's wrath. Vlad did not invent this punishment. It was used by the Ottomans and others, but he perfected it, scaled it up, and turned it into an instrument of state policy. He used it to communicate his authority to a population hardened by generations of violence. A simple execution was forgotten in a week. A field of impaled men, women, and children was a message that burned itself into the collective memory of a nation. If you find this exploration of the darker side of history compelling, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Your support helps us delve into these unsettling but important stories from our past. Dracula's reign of terror began not against the Turks, but against his own people. He inherited a kingdom plagued by the Boyars, a class of wealthy landowners who had assassinated his father and older brother, and who frequently shifted their allegiance to whichever foreign power offered them the most advantage. They saw the prince not as a sovereign, but as a first among equals, whom they could depose at will. Vlad was determined to break them. One of his most infamous acts of domestic consolidation occurred during an Easter feast in 1457. He invited hundreds of boyars and their families to his court in Targovishte. After they had feasted and celebrated, surrounded by armed guards, Dracula confronted them. He asked them how many princes they had lived under. The nobles, flustered, admitted to having served under many, boasting of their long family histories. Their pride was a confession. It proved to Vlad their disloyalty and their role in the kingdom's instability. According to the stories, he had the older boyars and their families seized on the spot. They were dragged outside and impaled on stakes that had been prepared in advance. The younger, healthier nobles were spared this fate, but only for a worse one. They were chained together and force-marched 50 miles to the ruins of a remote castle in the mountains overlooking the Argesh River. There they were forced into slave labor, tasked with rebuilding the fortress that would become Poenari Castle, Dracula's legendary citadel. They worked until their fine clothes fell off their backs and they dropped dead from exhaustion, their bodies left to rot where they fell. With one brutal stroke, Vlad had decapitated the old Boyar leadership and sent an unmistakable message to the survivors: loyalty was not optional. His next target was the Saxon merchants of Transylvania, particularly those in the cities of Brasov and Sibiu. These were German settlers who controlled much of the region's trade and had long enjoyed special privileges. When they defied Dracula's new protectionist trade laws and supported his rivals for the throne, his retribution was swift and spectacular. In 1459, he led a lightning raid into the lands around Brasov. He rounded up thousands of people, not just merchants, but men, women, and children. He had them all impaled on a hill overlooking the city. The chronicles, written by the Saxons themselves and therefore hostile to Vlad, paint a ghoulish picture. They claim that while the victims slowly died on their stakes, their limbs twitching and their groans filling the air, Dracula brought a table and enjoyed a leisurely dinner. He reportedly dipped his bread in the blood that dripped from the bodies above him. While this detail is likely propaganda designed to dehumanize him, the core event is not disputed. He turned a punitive raid into a piece of performance art, a terrifying tableau meant to be seen from the city walls. He did the same to the merchants of Sibiu, creating another forest of the impaled. His message was brutally clear: my economic policies are not suggestions. Defy me, and you will become a public art installation. These domestic purges, while horrific, were merely a prelude, a rehearsal for his ultimate confrontation with the power he hated most, the Ottoman Empire. For the first few years of his reign, Vlad maintained a tense peace with the Sultan, even continuing the traditional payment of jizya, a tribute paid by non-Muslim vassals. But he was merely buying time, building his army and fortifying his lands. The breaking point came in 1459. Sultan Mehmed II, the same man who had been Radu's friend and Vlad's keeper, sent envoys to demand the overdue tribute and a levy of 500 Wallachian boys for his elite Janissary corps. This was a standard demand, but for Dracula, it was an intolerable echo of his own childhood trauma. He refused. To punctuate his defiance, he committed an act of calculated insult. When the Ottoman envoys appeared before him and refused to remove their turbans, citing religious custom, Dracula praised their piety. He then offered to help them strengthen their custom. He had his guards seize the envoys and nail their turbans to their skulls with 3 spikes each. As they were dragged away, screaming, he reportedly told them he wanted to ensure their headwear would never be removed by accident. This was more than an act of rebellion. It was a declaration of war. Mehmed II was not a man to be trifled with. He was the conqueror of the invincible city of Constantinople, a brilliant strategist with the resources of a vast empire at his command. He responded to Vlad's provocation by sending a force of 1,000 cavalry under the command of Hamza Pasha to either capture Dracula or kill him. But Vlad had been raised among the Turks. He knew their tactics, their mindset. He laid a trap. He met Hamza Pasha in a narrow pass near Giurgiu and ambushed the Ottoman force, slaughtering them almost to a man. He captured Hamza Pasha himself. Now, Vlad would demonstrate the full scope of his cruelty on the international stage. He took his high-value prisoner back to his capital and had him impaled on the highest stake of all, a punishment befitting his rank. The rest of the captured Turkish soldiers were impaled on smaller stakes surrounding their commander. The message was sent directly to Mehmed: your power means nothing here. Your commanders will die just like anyone else, only higher. The Sultan was enraged. This was not just rebellion, it was humiliation. He vowed to crush the impudent Wallachian prince. In the spring of 1462, Mehmed assembled a colossal army, estimated to be over 90,000 strong, one of the largest forces ever seen in Europe at the time. He personally led this host across the Danube into Wallachia, intending to wipe Dracula from the face of the earth and turn his principality into an Ottoman province. This brings us to the climax of Dracula's story, the legendary campaign of 1462. Facing an army that outnumbered his own forces by at least 3-1, Vlad knew he could not win a conventional battle. He had to wage a different kind of war. He adopted a total, scorched earth policy. As Mehmed's massive army advanced, it found a desolate, empty land. Vlad had evacuated the populace, burned his own villages, destroyed the crops, and most cruelly, poisoned the wells and watering holes. Small, mobile units of Wallachian cavalry launched relentless guerrilla raids, striking the vast Ottoman columns at night, causing chaos and melting back into the forests and swamps they knew so well. Dracula went further, engaging in a primitive form of biological warfare. He reportedly gathered victims of horrific disease, tuberculosis, leprosy, and most terrifyingly, the bubonic plague, and sent them to infiltrate the Ottoman camps, hoping to spread pestilence among the invaders. The Ottoman army, though vast and powerful, was slowly being demoralized. They were marching through a haunted land, fighting a phantom enemy who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Their supplies dwindled, sickness began to spread, the heat was oppressive, and the constant fear of ambush wore on their nerves. The psychological campaign reached its zenith with what is now known as the night attack. On the 17th of June, 1462, under the cover of darkness, Dracula himself led a daring raid directly into the center of the Sultan's camp. Dressed as Turks and using Turkish phrases he had learned in his youth, Vlad and a few thousand of his best men slipped past the sentries with the goal of assassinating Mehmed in his personal tent. They wrought havoc, cutting down men in their sleep, setting fire to tents, and creating mass panic. The Ottoman soldiers, confused and terrified, began fighting each other in the dark. While Dracula failed to reach the Sultan's magnificent tent, and his men apparently got lost and attacked the tents of two high-ranking viziers, instead, the raid was a stunning psychological victory. It proved that nowhere was safe, not even the heart of the camp, protected by tens of thousands of elite soldiers. It made Dracula seem like a supernatural force, a demon who could walk through walls and strike at will. But this was still just the overture. The true masterpiece of terror was yet to be unveiled. After the disorienting night attack, Sultan Mehmed, shaken but resolute, pushed his army onward toward the Wallachian capital of Targovishte. He expected to find Dracula's main force ready for a final decisive battle. Instead, about a mile from the city gates, his advance guard reined in their horses, their faces pale with disbelief and horror. The Sultan rode forward to see what had caused the halt, and there it was. Stretching across the valley before him was the culmination of all of Dracula's rage, a meticulously crafted monument to atrocity. It was the forest of the Impaled. The Greek chronicler Leonikos Chalkokondyles, whose father had served the Byzantine court and who wrote extensively about the fall of Constantinople and the rise of the Ottomans, described the scene. He wrote, "The Sultan's army came across a field with stakes, about 3 kilometers long and 1 kilometer wide, and there were large stakes on which they could see the impaled bodies of men, women, and children, about 20,000 of them, as they said." He noted the decaying corpses of the Turkish prisoners Vlad had captured in his earlier campaigns, including the body of Hamza Pasha, still rotting on the highest stake, a place of honor in this hellscape. The air was thick with the stench of decomposition, a foul miasma that clung to the back of the throat. The only sounds were the cawing of crows and ravens, grown fat from the feast, and the dry rustle of wind against desiccated skin. This was not a chaotic massacre. It was a calculated display of psychopathic order. The bodies were arranged in concentric circles, with the tallest stakes in the center, reserved for the most important victims. It was a terrifying hierarchy of death. Imagine the effect on Mehmed's soldiers. These were battle-hardened veterans, men who had seen the slaughter at the fall of Constantinople. They were not strangers to violence. But this was different. This was industrial-scale horror, a vision so grotesque, so inhuman, that it transcended the normal brutalities of war. It was designed to break the will, to communicate a message that no normal human being would go to such lengths. It screamed that the ruler of this land was not bound by any recognizable morality. He was a monster, and this was his kingdom. Even the Sultan, a man not known for his delicate sensibilities, was profoundly shaken. The chroniclers report that he stood in stunned silence for a long time, staring at the panorama of death. He is said to have remarked, "I cannot win this land from a man who does such things, who has such a diabolical understanding of how to rule and how to defend his country." He had not been defeated by force of arms, but by the sheer, unholy audacity of his opponent. The immediate aftermath of this vision was decisive. The forest of the Impaled achieved its purpose perfectly. The morale of the Ottoman army, already frayed by weeks of guerrilla warfare, sickness and hunger, shattered completely. The will to fight, the desire to conquer this cursed land, evaporated. Sultan Mehmed II, the great conqueror, gave the order to retreat. He turned his massive army around and marched back to the Danube, leaving Wallachia behind. In military terms, Dracula had won. He had faced down the world's greatest superpower and forced it to withdraw, using terror as his primary weapon. But his victory was hollow and short-lived. While Mehmed retreated, he left behind a contingent of troops to support Vlad's own brother, Radu, known as Radu the Handsome. Radu, who had grown up in the Ottoman court and was loyal to the Sultan, promised the weary Wallachian Boyars peace and stability. He offered them an end to Dracula's terrifying and unpredictable rule. The Boyars, who had lived in mortal fear of Vlad, quickly abandoned him and flocked to Radu's side. Vlad's victory against the Turks had become a political defeat at home. His own subjects had chosen the handsome, pliable puppet of the Ottomans over their terrifying, monstrous savior. Betrayed by his own people, Dracula was forced to flee to Transylvania to seek help from his supposed ally, Matthias Corvinus, the King of Hungary. But another betrayal awaited him. Matthias Corvinus, instead of helping, had Vlad arrested. The official reason was a letter, likely forged by Vlad's Saxon enemies, which purported to show Dracula offering his allegiance to the Sultan and plotting against Hungary. The real reason was political expediency. The King of Hungary had received funds from the Pope for a crusade against the Ottomans, funds he had used for other purposes. By arresting the famous anti-Ottoman crusader Dracula, he could present a scapegoat to the papacy, claiming Vlad's treachery had sabotaged the entire campaign. So, the son of the dragon, the man who had faced down the Sultan's army, was dragged away not in glorious battle, but in political intrigue. He spent the next 12 years as a prisoner in Hungary, his reign of terror over. The indignity was profound. The man who had built a forest of corpses was now confined to a castle, a political pawn whose fearsome reputation was now just a story. In analyzing the legacy of Vlad the Impaler, we are confronted by a deeply uncomfortable truth. His methods were monstrous, his cruelty seemingly limitless. And yet, in the brutal context of his time, they worked. He took a weak, fractured principality, terrorized its corrupt nobility into submission, and for a time stared down the Ottoman Empire. His cruelty was not random sadism, though he may well have been a sadist. It was a meticulously crafted tool of statecraft and psychological warfare. His forest of the Impaled was the 15th century equivalent of a weapon of mass destruction. Its power lay not in the number of people it killed, but in the number of minds it conquered through fear. The stories of his actions, amplified by the new technology of the printing press, spread throughout Europe. German pamphlets funded by his Saxon enemies depicted him as a blood-drinking, baby-eating demon, cementing his image as the archetype of evil. This was a form of post-mortem violence, a propaganda campaign that sought to erase the political context of his actions and replace it with the simple caricature of a monster. And this, of course, laid the groundwork for the ultimate irony of his legacy. In the late 19th century, an Irish author named Bram Stoker, searching for a name for his fictional vampire count, stumbled upon the name Dracula and a few embellished details of his cruelty. The historical Vlad, the brutal warlord fighting for his nation's survival, was erased, consumed by the shadow of the Gothic monster he inspired. For many Romanians today, he remains a complex figure, a cruel but effective leader, a national hero who defended their land against impossible odds. The monster of Western fiction is, to them, the father of their country. So we return to that grotesque valley outside Targovishte. That forest of bodies was not merely the product of a single deranged mind. It was the product of a deranged world, a world of relentless violence and zero-sum power politics. Vlad Dracula held up a mirror to the brutality of his age and magnified it 1,000 times, forcing even a man like Sultan Mehmed II to recoil in horror. He weaponized suffering, turning human bodies into a medium for political messaging. And this is where his story, separated from us by more than 5 centuries, feels unsettlingly modern. The fundamental principle behind Vlad's forest is the same principle behind modern terrorism and psychological operations. It is the idea that an image of spectacular horror can be more powerful than an army, that fear is a weapon that bypasses soldiers and strikes directly at the will of leaders and populations. In an age of instant global communication, a single shocking video or a horrific photograph can shape public opinion and alter the course of conflicts. The technology has changed, but the dark corner of the human psyche that Vlad so expertly manipulated remains exactly the same. We live in a world governed by laws and norms that make a forest of the impaled seem like a distant, impossible nightmare. But the story of Dracula is a chilling reminder that these norms are a thin veneer, and that when survival is at stake, the definition of what is humanly possible can expand to encompass horrors we would rather not imagine.